Chapter 3. A call from Buteyko's wife. Protection against the lunatic asylum. Suspicions. On the morning of the 16th of May, Buteyko was lying in the boss's spacious office, which he was allowed to use until his health improved. The room was overflowing with flowers, brought by his colleagues from the laboratory and staff from other departments. Pomyekin was furious. Just a few days ago he himself had occupied the very same couch, suffering from an attack of angina. In the whole week he had only been given 2 puny little flowers, still standing mournfully in the dark green bottle on the window ledge. But Buteyko had been drowned in them. Any fool could see who was the uncrowned director of the Experimental Institute now. Uncrowned today, perhaps, but tomorrow. Pomyekin was beginning to regret giving Buteyko use of his room, but he hadn't really had a choice, as he didn't want to arouse the doctor's suspicions. That didn't seem to have worked, however. The professor was not mistaken. Buteyko not only suspected that someone wanted him dead at any cost, but was firmly convinced of it. Although Buteyko knew that the sea of flowers would only widen the gulf between him and his boss, he was still glad of them. They were a sign that he was needed at the Institute, and that he had good friends here as well as enemies. Again and again Buteyko played back the events of the previous night in his mind. He watched it all as if in slow motion, sometimes stopping the film to examine a frame more closely. The hideous screech of the brakes and the shattering of the windscreen merged into a single sound in the last frame that he managed to recall. A huge asphalt roller, parked for the night, became visible just beyond the bonnet in the faint light of the headlights that had doubtless been dimmed on purpose. If the doctor had been sitting in the front of the jeep, without holding on to anything, and after all people usually don't, his head would have smashed into its steel drum, and he would have been killed without a doubt. Even though he had braced himself with all his strength, using both his arms and legs, Buteyko's head had still broken the windscreen. Policemen rushed from the nearby station at the noise. With the help of the driver, who had escaped with mild fright, they managed to drag the doctor, covered in blood, out of the door and half-carried him into the duty room. "What made you do that, you idiot? There was a wooden barrier and sign in front of the roller." The doctor, still groggy, dimly made out the sergeant reprimanding the driver. "A car was coming in the opposite direction and blinded me with its headlights, the bastard," the driver weakly justified himself. "And so where is it, this other car?" the sergeant inquired disbelievingly, nodding to his men to help Buteyko to the washroom. "Why didn't it stop when there was an accident?" "Why would they stop?" the driver responded in a surly tone, clenching his creased cap in his hands. "Help the gentleman to rinse his face," the sergeant ordered the freckled young officer, who had already helped Buteyko as far as the door. "And we'll try to call an ambulance in a minute. We've not been able to get through to them yet for some reason. There must be a fault on the line or something." "There's no need for an ambulance," Buteyko replied weakly from the doorway. "I'm a doctor. Just let me get washed and give me iodine if you have any. We'll manage everything else ourselves at our place." "What do you mean, no need?" exclaimed the burly sergeant. "Your friend is holding his head." He turned towards Mutin, who had just come in from the street. "My friend, also, works in a hospital," said Buteyko with a hostile nod in Mutin's direction. "We really don't need an ambulance," Mutin confirmed, taking his hand away from his head. "There's nothing really wrong with me. I've dislocated my finger and got a few scratches." He rubbed the bruised area again. "So if Dr Buteyko doesn't think it necessary—" "I don't," snapped Buteyko, and wiping away the blood that was dripping from his forehead with a handkerchief, he followed the sergeant. Blinded by an oncoming car indeed, thought the doctor, as he rinsed his face under the tap and removed dozens of glass splinters from his face. "If you really had been blinded, you villain, you wouldn't be bringing me into a police station. You would have been carried away feet first on a stretcher yourself." Buteyko opened the vial of iodine from the first aid kit. The scoundrels thought they'd planned everything perfectly, he silently mused. The accident would take place right in front of a police station, and not in some isolated alleyway where something could obviously be contrived. An accident. A very cunning accident. The doctor carefully rinsed his mouth and spat out the red foam. Blood was gushing from a broken tooth. But they were wrong, he thought. I'm still alive. A report should be drawn up. Who knows, it could be useful in future. When he returned to the duty room, Mutin said that he'd managed to get through to the clinic and that someone was coming to pick them up. He was trying not to look the doctor in the eyes. Dr. Buteyko? The pretty nurse broke this train of depressing thoughts. You're going to get a phone call in a minute. Your wife in Moscow is worried. She rang the phone next door. I'll move the telephone closer to you. The nurse put the telephone on the bedside table. As she bent down to untangle the black cord, he caught a waft of expensive perfume. Then, with a smile, she left the room. His wife didn't wait long. What's happened? I couldn't sleep a wink last night, the receiver crackled. I rang your hospital, but no one could tell me what was going on. They told me you were a bit unwell and gave me that number. What's the matter? His wife's usually melodic voice was fraught with anxiety and distorted by static, bringing Buteyko back to reality. Calm down, Marina. Nothing much is wrong, Buteyko said as cheerfully as possible into the receiver. There was a bit of a road accident, and I got a few scratches. Irina got upset when she saw me worrying. She's been crying, interrupted his wife. Calm down, and calm Irina down too. Buteyko tried to add a note of strictness to his voice. I'm alive and practically well. An accident can happen to anyone. They spoke for a few more minutes. I begged you to make up with academician Daryev and not to leave Moscow, but you wouldn't listen, reproached his wife near the end of their conversation. I don't have a good feeling about Siberia. You've only just started working there, and this is the second time. What do you mean, second time? Buteyko abruptly turned over on the couch, wincing at the sharp pain in his right shoulder, but remembering where he was, he hastened to finish the call. All right, don't worry over nothing. Everything will be fine. Give Irina a kiss for me and pass on my regards to everyone. He replaced the receiver and lay back weakly. The collision with the roller was taking its toll. His head was spinning, and he felt sick. The second time. His wife's words echoed in his mind. That meant that she considered the boss's attempt to put him in a lunatic asylum as the first time. He naively hadn't believed Pomeykin when the professor said that he'd telephoned and written to her, saying that for the sake of your family's happiness, Buteyko should be sent for treatment in a psychiatric hospital before it was too late. But surely his wife hadn't taken Pomeykin seriously. Buteyko wrapped the blanket more closely around his wounded shoulder. She was a famous dancer with one of the country's biggest theatres. Could she, with her intelligence and sensitivity, believe a crass blackmailer? Could she take seriously Pomeykin's obviously ill-intentioned ravings about her husband's insane obsession with carbon dioxide? Didn't seem likely. Buteyko shut his eyes. On the other hand, he couldn't be certain. He'd begun to disagree with his wife about his discoveries back in Moscow, right after academician Daryev had refused to support him. You excelled at everything. Daryev took you on as a postgraduate. He would have considered you his deputy, his indignant wife had said. But you became obsessed with carbon dioxide. You fell out with Daryev and ruined your whole career. She was graceful, even when angry. She was the best Spanish dancer in her company and tried not to lose her poise, even when upset. Yes, it would seem that his wife had believed Pomeykin when he said that her husband wasn't in his right mind. His body ached. A drowning man might grasp at straws, but Buteyko knew that he could only depend on himself. When the doctor felt a gulf opening up between him and the boss, he stopped relying on his wife's support or his friend's sympathy. In the face of grave danger, and Buteyko considered the lunatic asylum to be the greatest threat, they would cave in. In the end, they were powerless. Ignaz Semmelweis and his follower Professor Lister were a terrible warning. The doctor knew that only the powers that be could save him from the lunatic asylum or even a prison cell. He'd hastened to win their support when the first cracks appeared of the fissure that would later become an abyss. Buteyko cured the district head of the KGB in a few sessions. The colonel had caught a heavy cold during a long night operation conducted in the line of duty. Acute bronchitis then became chronic, and his asthma attacks were unbearable. During the colonel's first examination, Buteyko had artificially induced a severe asthma attack and then relieved it without using any injections or tablets. This had convinced the colonel of the doctor's method once and for all. Of course, the numerous other patients who'd passed through his hands also believed in it, but they couldn't rescue their saviour from the abyss opening up between him and his boss. But the colonel could, Buteyko knew. His second protector was none other than one of the highest-ranking Communist Party officials in the region. Interestingly, they'd met thanks to Professor Pomeykin. Forgetting about his smarting shoulder for a moment, Buteyko smiled broadly. Pomeykin, Mutin, and Party Secretary Petrov had visited his laboratory at the end of October last year. The professor couldn't wait to show off the new complexator to party bosses. Seeing how Buteyko and his assistants brought back patients from the brink of the grave, the secretary had taken Buteyko aside into a separate office. The party secretary had sat silently smoking for a long time. Then he suddenly stubbed out his cigarette and demanded, "Can you swear not to tell anyone about my illness?" Buteyko was dumbfounded. "Can you, or not?" Petrov's face was distorted by a nervous twitch. "Of course I can," the doctor quickly reassured him. "You know," Petrov unbuttoned his well-made jacket and loosened his suffocating tie, "a strange thing has been happening to me for the last few years. I get up quite early in the morning, do my exercises, and splash myself with water, and even so I feel so lethargic and exhausted, it's almost unbearable. I have a splitting headache as if I've been drinking, my blood pressure soars, and my heart starts playing up. I sweat like a pig. I need to get to work, but I'm afraid to step out of my flat." Buteyko listened without interrupting. There was genuine pain in Petrov's deep-set eyes. "And I don't know what to do," he said, helplessly shaking his head. "When I'm at work, I seem to calm down, but next morning it all happens again. I've seen all the leading specialists. A doctor with a PhD in medical science created a series of breathing exercises especially for me and takes me through them every morning. Inhale, exhale, inhale, exhale." As he imitated the exercises, Petrov swung his arms out to the sides. "It doesn't work." The party secretary's shoulders slumped. "As soon as the alarm clock shows 6 a.m., I start to shake." He fell silent once more and looked questioningly at the attentive doctor. "Maybe you could help me with your complexator," he said at last. "You know," said Buteyko calmly, putting two and two together in his head, "I probably could help you, but," Buteyko spoke more slowly, "since I've given you my word, please try to take my advice seriously, no matter how strange it might seem to you at first." Petrov stood up. "Would you show me again how this doctor teaches you to breathe?" "Inhale." Petrov stood with his feet shoulder-width apart and stretched his arms out to the sides, filling his chest with air. "Exhale." He brought his arms together. "Inhale." He stretched his arms above his head. "Exhale." "It's happening again." The party secretary suddenly went pale and clutched at his heart. "I'm dizzy and my heart's pounding. Isn't there any cure?" He groaned and sank back into his chair. "There is definitely a cure," said Buteyko, with an enigmatic smile. "What?" Petrov frantically grabbed the tail of Buteyko's starched coat. "Throw him out." "Who?" Petrov let go of the coat. "Your doctor with a PhD in medical science," came the doctor's cool reply. "When?" asked the confused party secretary. "Next time he comes to do exercises with you, throw him out." Buteyko cupped his chin in his left hand. "He's making you overbreathe. He's damaging your health when you do your breathing exercises. In my opinion," the doctor took his hand away from his chin, "it's sabotage against you." Maybe someone sent him? What do you mean, over-breathing? Why sabotage? Surely it couldn't be. Petrov drew close to Buteyko. A vein was throbbing in his neck. Do you know what is the result of a single deep breath? Buteyko motioned for the party secretary to sit down again. It disables you for a minimum of 5 or 6 minutes for the time it takes for your body to recover the carbon dioxide it has lost. Just one breath. And how many of them are you taking during your exercises? Does deep breathing really have such serious consequences? The perplexed Petrov was plainly disbelieving. Let's not waste time. As always, Buteyko became animated when talking about his discoveries. We'll just do a small experiment. He retrieved a stopwatch from his pocket. Would you breathe as deeply as possible, please? The party secretary shook his head, and it was plain that he took the whole business as a joke. He opened his mouth and took several deep breaths. Keep going. Deeper. Deeper. The doctor didn't let him stop. After 2 minutes, Petrov couldn't stand any more. I can't go on, he gasped. I've an awful headache and there's a kind of ringing, and my head hurts. The vein on his neck was throbbing more intensely. Good. The doctor relented, attentively observing his patient. And now, do the opposite. Try to breathe more shallowly. Reduce your breathing. Buteyko saw that as Petrov limited his breathing, the livid patches disappeared from his face. Well, how do you feel? He asked. You know, better. Much better. The party secretary raised his eyes to Buteyko's in surprise. They were clear, as if a film had been removed from them. Do I need to demonstrate the benefit of deep breathing to you again? Inquired the doctor, suppressing a smile. No, said Petrov slowly. Your arguments are clear. But how did you manage? That's another question, interrupted the elated Buteyko. You need to understand the theory. He explained the basics to Petrov and told him how to train at home. 2 weeks later, he saw the party secretary again. Thank you, Dr Buteyko, from the bottom of my heart. Those awful attacks stopped as soon as I started breathing, as you told me. They've completely disappeared. And that doctor with the PhD, I sent him packing. He won't trouble me again. As he warmly grasped the doctor's hand in farewell, Petrov said, If you ever need my help, don't hesitate. I'll always support you. Buteyko narrowed his eyes against the bright spring sunshine. Petrov had most definitely kept his word. Buteyko had heard about his reaction to Pamirkin's suggestion of placing Buteyko in a psychiatric hospital. The party secretary believed in him. But his wife? Buteyko felt an uncomfortable tightness in his chest. Marina, it would seem, did not. The second time, oh heavens, the second time. Again and again he remembered his wife's words on the telephone. It was hard. Buteyko rearranged the warm blanket. It was hard when you were forced to doubt your own wife. However, they had disagreed on fundamental matters before. Take, for example, their attitude to Stalin. The doctor hated the dictator with every fibre of his being, but, like the majority of her cronies, his wife hero-worshipped him. It was difficult for the doctor to believe that his nearest and dearest adored his deadly enemy, but such was the case, and Buteyko was powerless to prevent it.